The Tennessee hills of 1893 were quiet, but never truly silent. On certain evenings when the fog rolled low and the crickets sang like 1,000 whispers, the old wood cabins seemed to hum with stories of their own. Perched at the edge of Maple Hollow was one such cabin, a small, lonesome home belonging to Eleanor Haskins, the widow on the hill. Folks rarely saw her in town except on Sundays when she'd sit at the back pew of the small white church, face veiled by a dark bonnet. 5 years had passed since her husband Thomas died of the fever that swept through the valley. Once cheerful and full of laughter, Eleanor now spoke little. She spent her evenings staring at the fireplace where a large oak trunk rested, a trunk Thomas had crafted himself, with brass corners and carvings of climbing vines. Some said it held his belongings. Others whispered it contained her grief, but no one really knew, for the widow never spoke of it. One stormy night the wind howled like a lonely wolf through the Tennessee holler. Rain battered the tin roof, and lightning painted the hills in brief, wild flashes. Eleanor sat beside the fire, darning an old quilt, when it happened. Knock, knock. She froze. The sound came not from the door, but from inside the cabin. Her gaze darted around until it landed on the trunk. A moment passed. Then, knock, knock, knock. Her blood turned cold. "Lord, help me," she whispered. Slowly, she stood and approached the trunk, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the storm. "Thomas?" The name escaped her lips before she could stop it. Silence. Then a long, slow creak as the wind shifted the shutters. She backed away, clutching her shawl, whispering prayers until the thunder drowned them out. Morning came soft and golden. The world outside glistened with rain. Eleanor sat staring at the trunk, now still and harmless looking in the daylight. She touched its lid gently, running her fingers along the carvings her husband's hands had once made. "You always did build things too well, Thomas," she said with a faint smile. But deep down, she felt something had changed. The air in the cabin felt heavier, as though something unseen was waiting to be acknowledged. She tried to busy herself with chores, sweeping, tending the garden, and feeding the hens, but every creak of wood made her flinch. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the trunk, and every time thunder rolled, she half expected to hear it knock again. 2 days later, Eleanor finally made her way down into Maple Hollow to buy lamp oil and flour. The townsfolk, as usual, watched her from afar, whispering. At the general store, she met a man she'd never seen before. Tall, thin, with kind gray eyes and a rough wool coat. He was helping old Mrs. Tanner load supplies into her wagon. "Good man, that preacher," someone said beside her. "Came through from Kentucky. Calls himself Reverend Cole, helps folks fix fences, says all he asks in return is a meal and a dry place to sleep." When Eleanor's turn came at the counter, she noticed him glance her way, tipping his hat politely. "Ma'am," he said. She nodded shyly. "Afternoon, Reverend." His voice was gentle, steady in a way that seemed to quiet the world for a moment. As Eleanor left the store, she found Reverend Cole waiting outside with his pack. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said. "You live up by the ridge, don't you?" "That's a long walk with those parcels." She hesitated, then allowed him to help carry them. The road back wound between chestnut trees and over small brooks. They spoke little, but his presence made her feel oddly at ease. When they reached her cabin, he stopped to admire the craftsmanship. "Fine work," he said, pointing to the oak frame of the porch. "My husband built it," she said softly. His eyes softened. "He must have been a good man." "He was," she whispered, glancing at the trunk inside through the window. "And he left more behind than I've been ready to face." The Reverend looked puzzled but didn't pry. Instead, He offered to fix her broken shutter before the next rain. She agreed. That evening, Reverend Cole stayed in her spare room, grateful for a warm roof. The night was thick with thunder again, the kind that shakes the hills to their roots. Eleanor sat reading by lamplight when she heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Her hands froze on the book. Slowly, she turned her head toward the trunk. The knocking came again, distinct, deliberate. "Reverend," she called out. Cole appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. "What is it?" Her eyes were wide. "It's that trunk. It's knocking again." He frowned, then stepped closer. Together they listened. For a long moment, nothing. Then one final, faint knock. Cole moved to it fearlessly, kneeling beside it. "Something's inside," he murmured. Eleanor shook her head violently. "That's impossible." The wind outside howled as if in reply. Reverend Cole stayed by the trunk, running his fingers over the brass lock. "When did you last open it?" he asked. "Never," she whispered. "Not since Thomas passed. He told me it was for when I was ready." Cole looked up. "Ready for what?" "I don't know," she said, trembling. He reached for the latch, but she stepped forward sharply. "No," her voice cracked. "Please. I can't bear what might be in there." "Not yet," Cole nodded slowly, respecting her fear. "Then we wait," he said gently. "But the knocking? It isn't something evil, Mrs. Haskins. Maybe it's just something unfinished." She turned away, tears glinting in her eyes. "You speak like you know grief, Reverend." "I do," he said softly. "And sometimes grief knocks until you answer." The days that followed were tense. Eleanor tried to ignore the trunk, but the knocking returned every night, sometimes faint, sometimes firm, always around the same hour. She began waking before dawn, heart racing, afraid to sleep. The Reverend prayed aloud one evening, asking God to bring peace to her home. The next morning, a note appeared on her kitchen table, written in delicate cursive that she did not recognize. It said, "You can't keep the past locked away forever." She gasped, showing it to Cole. "You wrote this?" He looked startled. "No, ma'am. I swear I didn't." They both stared at the trunk. The room felt colder than before. Determined to put an end to the torment, Eleanor suggested they move the trunk outside into the open air. Together they tried lifting it, but it was strangely heavy, as though something or someone resisted from within. The hinges groaned, almost alive. Cole stepped back, sweat on his brow. "That's no ordinary trunk," he muttered. Eleanor whispered, "Thomas built it right after we lost our baby." Her eyes clouded. "He worked day and night." Said it helped him forget the silence in the house. Cole looked at her gently. "And you never looked inside?" "No. He told me to wait until my heart was strong enough." Cole straightened. "Maybe now is that time, Mrs. Haskins." Eleanor stared at the trunk for a long moment, the firelight flickering across her face. Finally, she removed a rusted key that hung on a chain around her neck. She had worn it for years, never daring to use it. Her hand shook as she placed it in the lock. It turned with a weary click, and the lid opened slowly with a deep, sighing sound, like the release of years of bottled sorrow. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, lay letters, dozens of them, each tied neatly with blue ribbon, each one addressed to Eleanor Haskins from her husband Thomas. The earliest dated back to 1888, the last from the week before his death. Her lips trembled as she opened the first one. Thomas's familiar handwriting flowed across the page. "My dearest Ellie, if these words find you, it means I am gone from your sight, but never from your side." Her tears fell freely onto the paper. For years, she had lived in silence, never knowing he had left her this. A voice through time. Reverend Cole bowed his head as she read, whispering a prayer of peace. The knocking was gone now. Only the crackle of the fire remained. Eleanor sat beside the trunk all through the night, reading Thomas's letters one by one. The ink had faded, but his voice was alive on every page. He wrote about small things, mending fences, whittling spoons, the way the morning dew looked on her hair when she worked in the garden. But in every letter there was a tenderness that reached across the years. "You were my home, Ellie," one line said. "If the Lord calls me before you, promise me you'll still watch the sunset for the both of us." By the time she reached the final letter, her tears had soaked the pages. She took a breath and unfolded it slowly. The last lines read, "If ever you hear knocking, my love, do not fear. It means I am still here, reminding you that love never dies, only changes form." Eleanor pressed the paper to her chest, whispering, "Oh, Thomas, you knew I'd need to hear this." The fire crackled softly, and for the first time, she didn't fear the sound. Morning light streamed through the cabin's windows, painting golden stripes across the floor. Reverend Cole, who had fallen asleep in a chair nearby, stirred awake as Eleanor gently stacked the letters. But something caught her eye. The trunk's bottom panel looked uneven, as if one of the boards had been replaced. Curious, she pressed on it. It gave slightly under her touch. "Reverend," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something else." Together they pried it loose with the blade of a fire poker. Beneath it lay a small wooden box, wrapped carefully in a faded piece of linen. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was a delicate silver locket, tarnished but still gleaming faintly, and a folded piece of parchment. She opened the note and read aloud, "For the child who never got to be born." A sob escaped her lips. The locket clicked open in her hand. Inside were two tiny engraved initials, E.H. and T.H., and beside them, a faint, hand-drawn image of a baby's footprint. Cole bowed his head in reverence. "He carried that grief in silence," he said quietly. "So did I," she whispered. That day, the Tennessee hills held their breath. Eleanor sat on the porch with the locket in her palm, staring at the sky through tears that wouldn't stop. "I thought I was the only one who remembered," she said softly. "We never spoke of it again after I lost the baby. He just went quiet, built that trunk, worked himself near to death." Cole nodded. "Some men grieve with their hands. They build things, so the pain has somewhere to live." Eleanor looked at him through trembling lashes. "And I locked that pain away inside this trunk. Maybe we both did." The Reverend placed his hat over his heart. "Perhaps this was his way of freeing it. And you." The evening breeze stirred the letters inside the open trunk, making them flutter like soft voices speaking between worlds. It didn't take long for the townsfolk to start talking. By the following week, word spread across Maple Hollow that strange happenings had returned to Widow Haskins' place. Lights flickering, voices in the night, and the preacher himself lodging there to keep the ghosts calm. Some called it witchcraft. Others said the widow had gone mad. When Eleanor finally came into town for the Sunday service, people fell silent as she walked past. But she didn't bow her head this time. After the sermon, she stood up in front of everyone and said, "The only spirit that visited my home was love. And it came to remind me that God doesn't bury the living with the dead." The church stayed silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, heads began to nod. Spring came early that year. The ground thawed quickly, and the air smelled of rain and wildflowers. Eleanor began to dig behind her cabin, not to bury, but to plant. She filled the hillside with apple saplings, wild lavender, and white roses. Reverend Cole helped, rolling up his sleeves and working beside her. When they grew tired, they would rest on the porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped behind the ridge. From inside the cabin, the old trunk would sometimes give a faint knock, almost gentle, like the beating of a heart. Eleanor smiled each time she heard it. "That's Thomas," she'd say. "He's telling us we're doing just fine." One afternoon, while they were pruning the new trees, Reverend Cole spoke quietly. "There's something I never told you, Mrs. Haskins." Eleanor looked up. "What is it?" He hesitated, then said, "I knew your husband, years ago, back when I was a different man. Before I found the Lord." She blinked in surprise. "You knew Thomas?" "Yes. I was a broken drifter then. Hungry, desperate, ashamed. He gave me food, tools, and a job fixing his fence. He never judged me. He said everyone deserves a second chance." Eleanor's eyes filled. "That sounds like him." Cole nodded. "When I saw your name in town, I knew God had sent me here for a reason. Maybe to repay the kindness he once showed me. Through you." She smiled softly. "Maybe God sent you here for both of us." Months passed, and the garden thrived. The townsfolk began visiting often, bringing seeds, pies, and stories. The widow's cabin, once feared, became a place of warmth. But one night, a fierce storm swept through the valley. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder rolled like drums from heaven. Eleanor rushed to close the shutters when a lightning flash illuminated the room. The trunk had toppled over near the hearth. Then, through the roar of the storm, she heard it. One last knock, slow, deliberate, and final. She knelt beside it, tears mixing with rain dripping through the roof. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered. "You've done your part. I'm all right now." A sudden gust blew the window open, and just like that, the air in the room changed. The heaviness was gone. Peace settled like a warm blanket. The next morning, the storm had passed. The hills glistened beneath the new sun. Reverend Cole found Eleanor asleep by the hearth, the trunk beside her. A folded letter lay atop it, one they had never seen before. The ink was dark and fresh, as though written that very night. Eleanor awoke as Cole handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she read aloud, "You've done it, Ellie. You've opened your heart again. Don't close it this time. Love is not the end of grief. It's the way through it." The handwriting was unmistakable, Thomas's. Eleanor pressed the letter to her lips, smiling through tears. "He's gone home now," she said softly. "Truly home." Years passed. The widow's hair turned silver, and the Reverend's face grew lined, but the two remained dear friends. The Haskins garden became the pride of Maple Hollow. Children came to pick flowers, couples strolled through the apple orchard, and travelers stopped just to see the place where love had spoken from a trunk. Eleanor kept the trunk on her porch, polished and open, its contents no longer a secret. Inside were Thomas's letters, and new ones, written by her own hand to anyone who came seeking comfort. Each began the same way. "If you are reading this, remember, grief is just love that's learned to live with absence." Her home became a sanctuary for the lonely. And every so often, when the wind blew just right, the faintest knock could still be heard from the trunk, never haunting, only reassuring. On a golden autumn morning, the townsfolk found Eleanor sitting peacefully in her rocking chair, the trunk beside her, a smile on her face. She had passed away in her sleep, her hands resting atop an open letter that read simply, "I'm coming home, Thomas." The funeral was small but heartfelt. Reverend Cole, older now and walking with a cane, spoke before the gathered townsfolk. "She was the widow who listened," he said, "not to ghosts, but to love. She taught us that sometimes what we fear most isn't the past knocking. It's the future asking to be let in." That evening, as the sun set behind the Tennessee hills, the valley was still. Then, faint and steady from somewhere inside the cabin, came three soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. No one was frightened. They simply smiled, knowing it was love's last message. A promise kept across time. Love never dies. It only waits for us to open the trunk.